Welcome to Modern Financial Wellness, the podcast dedicated to helping you feel better about your finances. I'm your host, Jim Grace, and I'll be your guide as we discuss the psychology of money and explore the emotional aspects that shape our financial decisions and how we feel about them. A quick note before we start, although I do hope that you find the information on this show to be helpful, in no way are any of these discussions to be taken as specific financial advice. Please do your own research and talk to your own advisors, especially when making important financial decisions. All right, Kim James, thank you so much for joining me on Modern Financial Wellness. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I'm really excited to talk to you today about your work and the work that you do with clients, because I see it on my end of things as a financial planner. This idea or our high level conversation being around finding purpose in career or, some version of that. Where I see it oftentimes is clients will come to me and kind of present a financial concern. They don't feel like they have enough or they're doing enough. And as I get to know them over a longer period of time, sometimes I find that the root cause of how they're feeling really has to do with more where they are in their career or life, that they don't feel quite fulfilled or don't have a lot of purpose, just don't generally feel like they're in the right place anymore. And where do they go from there? And how do they kind of sort out where they want to be in their life? Is something that I don't think there's a lot of good frameworks or coaching around. And I think it's something that people kind of struggle with in silence. I think more people are dealing with this topic than we realize. So long-winded introduction to say thank you for being here. And I'm excited to talk to you about your work.
Yeah, and I'm excited to be here too, Jim. I second all of your comments. This is a challenge that many people face at one point or another in their career. And oftentimes they don't have the resources to work through those challenges on their own. So it's an issue that I feel deeply passionate about, having also gone through my own massive career transition about 7 years ago. So it's an issue that's very near and dear to my heart.
If you don't mind, I think that's a great segue. Can we spend a little bit of time? Can you just explain to people a little bit about your background and your story, how you went from, corporate America into coaching on the career side? What did that look like for you? Because I think it's really good context for the conversation that we're about to have.
Yeah. Actually, I have a 25-year corporate career. I started my career with an MBA in finance and basically spent a lot of years trying to find a place that felt like home in corporate America. So along the way, I was, always challenged. I felt like it was great for developing my skills and, being engaged in problems that were interesting, but it never really felt like home for me. And so the way I managed that was I made my way around a number of different companies and functions over the time that I was working in corporate America. I went through finance, operations, ultimately landed in IT. 15 years before I left corporate, I was already at a senior leadership role. So I came over into the IT space with a focus on large scale systems transformation and running IT like a business. That was a really fun and interesting job. But again, it didn't really feel a whole lot like it was playing to some of the more authentic parts of what I was interested in doing.
And did you get any coaching or assistance with that? Or were you just on your own intuitively trying to find a place that felt like home, to use your words?
More or less doing it intuitively. So I was someone who got restless when I wasn't feeling fully engaged or like I was deriving a lot of meaning out of my work. So I kind of look around at what else was out there. I had a very strong work ethic, so lots of opportunities presented themselves to me along the way. I was fortunate to make my way up the career ladder, and I kept thinking, well, if I have more influence, if I'm in a greater position of power, if, I'm doing something that's, more impactful to the direct company mission, maybe then I'll feel like I, have the equation right for me. And that
I feel like
really
I've heard that
happened.
Story before too. It's a lot of kind of A types, really driven people, successful people that aren't really feeling good about where they're at. So they just work harder and
they work
seem
harder.
to think with the promotions or accomplishments, it's going to alleviate that feeling. And that didn't happen for you, it
Oh
sounds
my
like.
gosh. Yes, it did not happen for me. And not only that, it took me a very long time to really identify that as sort of a fool's errand for me, that there was a pattern here, and that, as many moves as I was making, it still wasn't bringing me any closer to what I was looking for. And actually kind of got me further away from really feeling like I was making big impacts. So when I was in IT, I came over at a senior leader level. I actually was most recently in a divisional chief information officer role for Farmers Insurance Company, heading up a very large part of their IT function and engaged in big systems transformations. This is a highly political, highly time consuming job, very stressful. And it was in this role where it sort of clicked for me to say, you know what, the constant movement, the desire to like have more impact, it's not solving the problem for me. And as a matter of fact, now I'm feeling like my whole life is consumed with work, and it's not work that I'm necessarily finding to be meaningful and fulfilling for me. And it was an interesting dilemma because I had worked for this. This was what I had set out to do. And to find yourself in a point where you're thinking, you know what, I'm not sure this is it. And now my only options are to kind of suck it up and just know that it's not going to be solved with another move, or I can do something pretty bold and try something else. And I sort of feel like I was forced a little bit into the decision to leave because of some things that were going on in my personal life that required my attention, and I didn't have the bandwidth or capacity to deal with that. And I was in a new leadership structure within the organization I was with that wasn't really working out for me or for the person that I was reporting to. And so I did make, finally, at the beginning of 2017, the very scary, terrifying decision to leave the job. And it actually wasn't even it wasn't a decision that I had planned. I was in a conversation with my boss, and something came up, and it was a moment that I knew I cannot do this even one more year more than I'm doing it now. So in that conversation, surprised me and him by basically saying that I thought it was time for me to move on. He agreed. We parted ways, and I was basically on my own then, with no idea about what it was that I was going to do next. And so I spent a couple of years actually figuring that out. And it was a very terrifying process to be someone who is so focused and has always identified myself through the work that I do, to find myself in a position where I wasn't, first of all, in a vocation, and I didn't even know what that looked like. And second of all, had no plans of how to get there. And so when I actually transitioned into coaching a couple of years later, it was with the eye towards helping people in similar situations navigate that process. And to your point earlier, what was so surprising to me when I actually left my job was how many people I connected with who were experiencing similar challenges. When I was in my corporate roles, we just didn't talk about that. I just got the job
done and moved on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I just got the job done. And I also figured that everybody else had figured it out. And the problem was me. It never occurred to me that the problem was that I was trying to force, kind of my career into a construct that didn't suit me. So I kept looking around thinking, like, what do I need to fix about myself in order to make this work for what appears to be working for everyone else around me? And then I come to realize, well, actually a lot of people, like you said, are struggling with the same issue in silence. And that's really was the first iteration of my coaching business, was working with people, particularly women, who were facing similar challenges of having invested a significant amount of their blood, sweat, and tears into a career that was no longer suiting them.
Right. And you get to this point where it feels like, probably now what, right? I mean, your case, as you described it, it was extremely abrupt. So I anticipated you giving me a little insight into your kind of well thought out, mapped out exit, but it was just woke up one day and it all came to a head. And then you're kind of left sounding like you're dealing with, like, what is my identity? Like, big questions about where do you go from there? So that becomes the coaching business. So it's to help people like you that have gone through that and need some direction and need to kind of sort out where they should be and what that should look like. So how do you get people started on this sooner? Because I feel like a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
people let this linger for a long time. In your case, it sounds like 25 years, where you finally got to the point where you're going to take some action. How do we kind of kick this off? What are some of the first signals that people might start to recognize where it might indicate that they're not in the right spot?
Yeah. Yeah. And when I say it was 25 years, a lot of this started coming to a head towards the end of my corporate career because my values also started to shift significantly, as they do for most people as you go through, your 20s, 30s, and 40s. So when I was in my 20s and made my decision to pursue the business route, get my MBA, and do these corporate jobs, my values were very much aligned at the time around financial stability, having a job that looked, had carried good social capital with it, where, there was some safety and security in the work that I was doing. So those things were really important to me. And I do think my career in my early years very much fulfilled that, even though the work itself wasn't something that was gratifying. And then as I got older,
as I see polls come out continually back that up, right? You're not alone in that. Those goals change over time. And typically when we're younger, it's wealth and status driven early on. Yeah.
100%. And then you find yourself continuing on this path that was really set up for that wealth and stability and, kind of social capital. And then your values start to maybe veer off into a direction of wanting to have meaning and purpose through the work that you do, for example. And those paths start to get further and further apart. And oftentimes people don't reconcile them along the way to say, hey, you know what? My values are shifting. I'm feeling more called to do purposeful work. Here's the changes that I can make now. Instead, a lot of them do what I did. How do I make this continue to work for me? How do I shove myself into that, be that square peg, shoving myself into the round hole? And then a lot of them do get to a point where it can manifest as burnout, like it did for me, where it's just so overworked and so unfulfilled that it just, was in a moment, a decision.
And I imagine a lot of people too, the term golden handcuffs gets thrown around a lot, but this is a show about financial well-being. I'd imagine a lot of folks are just past the point of no return, or that's at least what they feel like. Did you struggle with any of that? Those thoughts about, have I saved enough? Have I done enough? Am I crazy? What were you going through in terms of that?
Absolutely. And I was fortunate that I did have good financial resources, but I also had a certain lifestyle. And I think the lifestyle I had built justified the job that I had. So I would justify working in the manner that I did by saying, well, I get to drive the nice cars and take the nice vacations and live in a nice house. But the reality of it was, and I think to your point, is that we do start to set up those lives that then become part of the challenge of making a decision in a different way. And so when you're looking at, I want to set up more meaningful, purposeful work, the realities of having to have certain levels of finances to support a lifestyle, whether you have kids or you have a mortgage or, you're paying off debts, things like that, do absolutely come into play and are a factor that need to be considered. So I was lucky in that I was able to take time with my process, but it's one of the reasons why I think engaging with a coach or having support in that can help, because you can start to make intentional decisions that align with the values you have later in life. So meaning and purpose could be one. You may also have financial goals and values that need to be fulfilled as well. And bringing that in and sort of doing a recalibration. You asked about, what is really the first step in engaging in this process, is really understanding where you're at in your life, what's important to you now, what are sort of the non-negotiables that you want to bring into your career, and then how big is the gap between where you are and where you want to go. I like to actually work with clients on what I call, it's, for lack of having a better way to describe it, a soul ego continuum. The ego side of the equation being, and I don't mean ego like, self-concept, but more ego of the things that help us feel safe and secure in life. Money, a stable job, kind of a certain level of comfort in what you're doing on one end of the continuum. And the other side is more about like, what is your soul kind of like reason for working? What are those things? That might look very different than what's on the other side of the equation. So if you're about meaning and purpose, or about stability, like understanding where you are on that continuum is a really important first step in deciding what career you want to pursue next.
That's really interesting because I think a lot of people, I think about a lot about self-actualization and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we're all hardwired to make sure that we're safe and secure and have the things that we need. But then there's also higher levels of that get into status within our community and social standing. And that always seems to compete with the emotional side. Your description using the term soul, they're kind of always at odds a little bit, right? And it sounds like maybe you're trying to align those two things, or at least help people understand where they kind of lean towards.
Yes, is every person is different. So when I left my career, I was very much on the soul side of the continuum. In other words, I can no longer do work just to collect a paycheck and to say that I have a nice job. Some people are very much around, you know what, I need to continue to earn a certain amount of income, and I'm willing to make trade-offs in terms of what's really meaningful for me. And they may just take some tweaks in their career. They may make tweaks around, maybe they're in a different industry or a slightly different role, learning some new skills, but building off of what they largely already have. In my case, it was a complete career pivot where I had to really grapple with the idea of being a senior level executive in a Fortune 250 company to becoming a coach, which in my mind, was like, well, you know what? That to me, I have my own beliefs about whether that's, prestigious enough for me to pursue. And I had to really work through my own limiting beliefs about what it meant to do work that I felt, I had, sort of done all this other stuff, and that I needed to be in something that was a little bit harder to achieve versus, a little bit more.
Did you battle any social comparison? Were you hesitant to come out with that? Were you fearful of how your former colleagues were going to look at you when you said you were going to become a coach?
100%. As a matter of fact, it took me 2 years to update my LinkedIn profile and claim the fact that
you were
I was
already coaching. Yeah.
And I was already coaching, and I was actually on the path of becoming a coach. And when I actually finally launched my coaching business was when I made the update. But I really had this idea in my head that a lot of my former colleagues would look at that and think like, oh, what happened to Kim? Remember when she was, this role or that role? And I find that's the case with a lot of my clients. The thing that they really want to do, the reason they may not be pursuing it is because it doesn't carry the same level of social capital as the thing that they're doing already. So, thinking about people in particular who want to do work in nonprofit or have a social cause or something that's maybe involved in, human development or the arts and creative work. People oftentimes, get messages early on that is not, the way you make a living, and it's not something that is valued in our culture and society. And that can become a reason that people gravitate towards work that doesn't fulfill them. And then over time, what happened to me tends to happen to them, which is they find themselves saying, this is not for me. And I'm at the point in my life now where my values have shifted to the point that I'm going to, I need to start looking at something different.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting point of all of this. And I'm curious your thoughts. Do people ever lean towards safety and social status, and they just resign themselves to the fact that they're going to have to stay in a certain lane for income or status or whatever it is? Career is career. But do you find that they can find other outlets to fulfill purpose and meaning? And does that ever work? Or do you kind of coach towards really trying to find your true self and do that rather than trying to make it all work? Because it sounds like, some people go down that path where I have to be here, I'm going to stay in this career, but it always ends up where people are burning out or just hitting a brick wall at the end of that. And it's like, how do you, again, reconcile those two things?
Yeah. So the thing that is, I consider success with my clients is when they understand how they're making decisions. And then whatever decision they make, if it's the right choice for them at that particular moment in their life, I call that success. So to answer your question, I've had many clients who will come in saying, I'm just not feeling fulfilled in the work that I'm doing. And then we go through the assessments that I do with them to understand their values, their non-negotiables, their strengths, what they naturally do well. We do purpose work, we do visioning work, we do all of that in the beginning. And what might come out for them is that their passion might be I had someone who wanted to do financial education with elementary school children. That was her passion, but for financial reasons, it wasn't something that she could pursue in the immediate future, but it was something that she was able to say, you know what, I have an idea of what I might do, 10 years down the line. And and what we actually identified was that a lot of what was making her unhappy were things in the environment that she was in. So she made the decision to look for a different environment, not a different career. So she was able to gain clarity around what made the most sense for her at this particular stage, and then perhaps have an idea of where she wanted to go as she got into a place where she had more financial independence to make different decisions. In my mind, that is as much of a success as I had another client who is an executive at a healthcare organization, and she thought she wanted to just make a tweak to her role, and she ended up becoming a consultant in the cannabis industry and starting her own business. So, you never know where these paths are going to go. It often doesn't look like what clients present with in the beginning, and that's just because they haven't had the resources, time, and support to help them really identify where they're at and what would best support them at the particular phase of life they're in.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I want to just go back to, you mentioned purpose and vision planning. We throw these terms purpose and meaning and vision for the future. Can you give us a little bit of an example of a coaching framework and really boil that down because I'm sure there's more practical ways to kind of guide people through those really big, sometimes abstract, heavy feeling terms. Do you have any quick examples of what does purpose and vision planning look like with a client? What are the things that you're focused on?
What we do in the purpose and visioning is we actually work with a couple of frameworks. One is Ikigai, which roughly translates, the Japanese use it to basically identify how you find meaning and purpose in life. And it sits at the intersection of what you're good at, what you're passionate about, what you can make money doing, and what the world needs. So we explore each of those parameters for a client. In the what you're good at realm, we look closely at their strengths. So I use Clifton strengths as an assessment to really help people identify what they innately do well. A lot of people spend time developing in areas that they're not innately good at. That often results in them not feeling competent or excited about work that they do in that area. So we really look to, are you someone who's analytical? Are you someone who's relationship oriented? Are you someone who's someone who's very comfortable being in charge? Are you someone who's a little bit, more reserved and problem solving oriented? So we look at all of those things to sort of fill out that what are you good at bubble of the Ikigai exercise. And then we look at the other factors, and then we look at how big are the gaps between them and what kinds of jobs might sit at the intersection. For the vision work, it's a simple exercise of people really describing what they want their life to look and feel like in 1 to 3 years. And that is independent of their job. So it's really, what problems are you solving? What do your relationships look like? Where are you living? What kinds of activities are you doing around work? And then we get more and more granular so that we fit career into the context of a bigger life framework. That's really important. So we do those kind of separate things within the Ikigai framework. And then once we have the vision, we have the Ikigai, we have their strengths, values, non-negotiables. Then what I do is I feed all of that information into ChatGPT and ask it to identify between 10 and 20 jobs that this person might be interested in doing. And that is the starting point of the conversation around, okay, what are some options for you to explore? So we look at each thing, and I have the client basically provide an assessment of, this feels, on a scale of 1 to 10, this feels like an 8. And here would be my next step to explore it further. This one feels like a 2, so we're not going to do any more work on it. And what we end up with is a handful of career possibilities that then they explore a little bit more to see if any of them they want to pursue. And then once they have an idea of what's next, then we go into the typical stuff like resume, LinkedIn, and job search.
That's a great description. And I'm glad we dug into those details, because to me, that really represents a really practical example of the support that you mentioned that coaching provides. Because it's funny, an overlap to a prior episode, we introduced Ikigai as a really interesting framework to start thinking about purpose and meaning. And that's just one example, I'm sure, that you walked us through that you use with clients. But that's where coaches and advisors and support people really can help clients get to the next level. Because I think a lot of folks intuitively have these feelings that they're not in the right place. They just don't have the tools and support to kind of bring them through the process to get to the other side and find these options. And kudos, that's a great use of the technology and AI to just sort that down and boil that down. How have the results, have you been happy since you started using ChatGPT with what the output comes back at? Yeah.
It's incredible. Actually, before ChatGPT, I was coaching before that was even around, and we were kind of hunting and pecking on Google to try to find things. And this has made everything so much more streamlined and broad. Like there are so many options that I would never come up with, or that we would never come up with. And what's so interesting about it is I'll look at the list. So I'll generate the list between sessions. So I'll just take everything and I'll have it ready to go for a session. And I'll look at some of the things on it and think like, oh, there's no way that my client is going to be interested in that. And I've been surprised at how many times they've come back and they're like, wow, that sounds perfect for me. And so I actually think the AI is smarter than I am. And really, it's scary smart, like in terms of really providing options that wouldn't have been possible or have come up otherwise. And what's often so interesting about that phase of it is that's really where you start to get people to get very accurate and clear about how many risks they're willing to take to make the thing that they want to do happen. So this is where it really becomes you know what, I would really love to do XYZ career. That sounds awesome to me, but I'm not willing to go back and, get another degree or to start over again with a minimal salary or to risk that I'm going to start a business and it could fail. And so then we start really getting into limiting beliefs. Like, okay, so, are these limiting beliefs that are, obstacles that we can overcome, or are they a statement of what's most important to you that really at this point in your life you don't want to look at? So it's
you get into some mindset work and kind of thinking 100%. About what's in front of them. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, so the mindset piece is really important. So for me, like I said, one of my biggest blocks was I was really limiting myself, which is why it took me a couple of years to decide on a profession, because I was limiting myself in terms of, well, it's got to be something that is impressive and looks good on paper and is prestigious. And the work that I wanted to do was in a realm that is prestigious and I think is incredibly valuable, but also has low barrier to entry. So anyone really can call themselves a coach. And in my mind, I was like, well, that's, that doesn't fit within my definition. That was a limiting belief. And once I was able to overcome that and say, you know what, my sense of fulfillment and being able to contribute to the world in the way that I want to through the work that I do is more important than, this construct of what, valuable work looks like. So that's often work then that we have to start looking at as we go through the process.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you describe that. And I'm thinking about, in your case, you started your own business, right? So if somebody's willing to take the risk and start their own business, they have a little bit more control. But are you finding people who might have a limiting belief that changing careers at a certain point in their working life just isn't going to work? They're not going to be attractive to employers. If you're, changing lanes can be challenging from the employer hiring standpoint. Do you run into, or how do you help people kind of get shifted in terms of their direction and noticeable and hireable and, all those things? Because I'd imagine that's something that comes up a lot.
It is. And it's actually, this is an area that I often, if I had a magic wand and I could change how the recruitment process works and the biases that drive recruitment, I would start there, honestly, because there's so much bias in recruiting that basically says a strong candidate looks like has certain qualifications. So a traditional resume, as I call it. So I've got X number of years of experience and X level of education and these particular qualifications. And what that does is it excludes non-traditional candidates from even being looked at. So it's a very
Mm-hmm.
exclusionary process. And what we use to basically say this is a good employee, actually, if you look at research from Accenture and other organizations, is not actually attributable in many cases to top job performance. So in other words, employers are looking for the wrong things. They're using the wrong proxies to identify who is a strong candidate. Oftentimes those candidates that have been doing the job for 10 or 15 years, they might no longer have a passion for it. So they come in at top dollar, highly competitive, coming in and not performing the same way someone who's passionate and interested in choosing the career with certain skill sets is going to be able to perform.
That's kind of a funny point, not to interrupt, but it's, they set themselves up to get the job changer who's on a search for something more meaningful, right? It's you at year 15 in your 25-year career who thinks that, maybe this time I'll feel more fulfilled. Those are the people that they're potentially screening for, right?
Yep.
Based on their criteria.
Absolutely. And we know, for example, that a lot of companies haven't really sat down to think through what are the skills that we actually need to do this job well. And oftentimes what falls out of that are the very things that they screen for. So having a very detailed technical background in a particular area, they may over-index on that and under-index on someone who is collaborative and problem-solving and resilient and able to work well with others and learn on the job and be adaptive and flexible. Like all the things that you need in the 21st century to work well is not what employers are generally screening for. So you bring in someone with technical competence who can't do these other things, they end up not working out as well as somebody who has actually intentionally set out to do a certain career. That connotes someone who is extremely motivated, highly, invested in themselves, willing to take risks and, believe in what their capabilities are. Those candidates are the ones that I see. They're often overlooked. So the way we work around that is through building the networks around the recruitment processes. So we actually look at what skills they have, what strengths they have, where they want to go. We write a resume that's more functionally oriented around the skills that they bring to the table. And then we do experience below that. So it really highlights like, these are things that I'm really good at and why they're important for what you're looking for. And then it's all about networking and really building relationships with the employers and the hiring managers that they want to be working for. But it does
kind of
take
finding a way in the door and your resume to the top of the stack, so to speak.
And yes, and in doing that, you have to be incredibly thick-skinned and resilient because of the ways that the recruitment processes are set up. You're going to hear a lot of crickets and you're going to get a lot of doors closed, on you. But what you're really looking for is one or two people, companies that are going to take a look at what you have to offer and give you that chance. And that's where your career transformation happens. So sometimes you have to go through 50 contacts to find that one or two people. So you just have to be really resilient to bounce back, knowing that by going through those 50, you're going to find the one or two that are going to make the difference. So again, that's where mindset becomes so important, is setting people up to know that this is a really difficult process and the systems are not going to work in your favor, but it absolutely is possible. You just have to sort of keep at it and take the steps that work.
Yeah. This is a bit of a side note tangent, but are you starting to see that evolve at all, the recruiting process? Are you starting to see it get a little better and have companies recognize an opportunity to build culture and find the right candidate for the right job rather than screening for kind of the standard technical background and education and all that? Are you seeing any movement there, or do we have a ways to go?
Not enough movement. We still have ways to go. When we were in the early days of COVID, when we were in the great resignation, and people were leaving their jobs at rates of 4 million a month. People were willing to walk away from jobs that were no longer fulfilling for them. Companies at that time were more motivated to work with the candidates that they were seeing on the job market. Now that the job market has tightened up a bit, I'm seeing a lot of companies actually undo a lot of the things that they were doing well during COVID. So we saw a lot of flexibility in how, remote work and working with people who wanted to be treated as a holistic worker, not just a, unit of productivity. Like all of those things that were trending in a certain direction, I'm seeing now are being reversed in this current job market where companies tend to be reverting back to what they have always done and what they know, rather than saying, hey, we've learned some things that can really help make us more effective employers going forward. Unfortunately, one of those is that companies tend to be looking again more scrutinizing more for specific skill levels and technical experience than soft skills. And I think that is going to continue to move because the data are there to basically support that. Right. If you are able to look for core skills as opposed to technical experience, you're going to end up with a better result.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Well, hopefully it continues to evolve in the right direction. Do you have any success stories? Were there anybody in particular that were really hesitant about these big changes and these big transitions and then got to the other side and said, why didn't I do this sooner? I'm sure you hear that, but are there any that come to mind as particularly kind of inspiring or worth sharing to folks? Because I envision people listening to this that might relate to it directly and say, gosh, I really should hire a coach. And I'm here to say that you should. And hopefully you reach out to Kim. But I still think there's going to be a lot of people that just think, I can't do it, right? I can't bring myself to make that change. What happens on the other side? What are some of the results when people are in the right place doing fulfilling work? Do you have anything that comes to mind that you'd want to share?
Oh my gosh, so many examples. I mentioned the woman who made the change from being an executive in a healthcare company in IT to running her own cannabis consulting business. She's killing it and doing fantastic work. I have another client who was in the nonprofit sector as executive director work in a number of nonprofits who she thought when she started working with me that she wanted to stay in that general lane and she wanted to do corporate social responsibility work where she was going to work not on the nonprofit side, but for profit in their philanthropy operations, helping them decide how they wanted to allocate funds. And as we were going through the process, she was not motivated to really go out there and hit the ground pretty hard with that new line of work. And I encouraged her to take a step back. We'd gotten very far in the process and I encouraged her to take a step back and rethink her options. And within a week or two, she came back and said that she wanted to help high school age students navigate the college application process. She realized this because she just helped her son go through his own process and she loved it. And she realized how much work was required. And she wanted to serve especially kids who didn't have access to resources to navigate those processes. She went back to school, she got her degree, and now she's running her own business and she's incredibly fulfilled doing that. Now, again, she had no idea that this was the direction that she was going to go, similar to the other client that I mentioned who thought she wanted to just do a slight pivot in her career. These were two people who came through the process and kind of went for it and said, I'm going to go for the thing that I really want to do. And then on the other end of the continuum, I had one client, a young woman with young kids who felt like she needed to be really grinding and working towards a promotion. And so she was really interested in how she could, bring a new skill level into a new job. And she actually, in working with me, learn that a lot of her ideas about what she thought she should be doing were coming from her own social conditioning and internalized expectations of what she should be doing with her career. She realized instead that she actually really loved the job that she had and where she was at the level that she had, and that her biggest priority was to spend more time with her kids. And so she actually took a step back in her career rather than pushing the accelerator and was incredibly fulfilled in doing that. And then the last story I'll share with you is an email that I just got yesterday from a former client who is a software engineer and decided that she wanted to go more into entrepreneurship, but she wasn't ready to pull the trigger at the time. And she just sent me an email that she got into an executive education program overseas. She wanted to work overseas. She wanted to be overseas, and that she quit her job and that she was going to be doing that in parallel with starting her own business. Wow. So, sometimes the work we do in the coaching work is planting the seeds for, a down the line change. But again, it's that clarity that they get going in that is so valuable for them to start making, sometimes small steps and sometimes very big steps.
Yeah, but it sounds like taking the first step, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be hiring a coach, but I think a coach is a great resource to lay out the process and provide the
Mhm.
support that so many people could really benefit from. Because a lot of times I think the technical answers are there. ChatGPT, if you prompt it, will give you a lot of information, but sometimes it's that human support that you provide as a coach that is really the reason that people go from start to finish through the process and end up with that result. So those are great. I appreciate you sharing. Is there anything else about your practice or process or folks thinking about big changes in their career and finding purpose that we left out that you'd want to share before I ask you a few last questions?
Yeah, I think one thing I didn't mention in some of the examples that I gave are the people who I work with, and I did touch on this a little bit with one of my clients, but the people who find that they are able to achieve career fulfillment by just making a couple of tweaks in their existing environment. So some of my clients identified like, hey, I'd rather be doing work in this area. And oh, by the way, my company does offer that kind of work. And so just helping them get ready to have conversations with their managers about what they're interested in and helping to align their current careers more in the direction that they want to go. That's some of the work that comes out of a coach as well, is really identifying options that maybe the client isn't even thinking about. Like,
Mm-hmm.
can I make it work where I already am? Maybe I don't have to make a big drastic change. So
Right.
that would be
Right.
maybe the one thing I would add.
And I'm glad you shared that because at the end of the day, there's no path to the same place for everybody, right? This is going to
Mm-hmm.
lead to a completely different destination after you've done the work than your neighbors and your colleagues and your friends. So I'm glad that you shared that with you. Last few questions is this being a show about financial well-being in general. Maybe when you were going through your transition or maybe today, are there any practices or habits, things you do on a regular basis that make you feel better, lower stress, help you feel motivated or focused? What types of things do you go back to that you feel like improve your well-being?
Oh my gosh. Yes, I have a morning routine, which changes all of the time, but right now looks something like 20 minutes of meditation, about 30 minutes of journaling. And if I can swing it, a walk in the morning. And if I can't get around to it in the morning, I definitely try to do it after work. And
Mm,
then actually, it's funny that you asked about this now because right before our call, I was noticing that my energy was particularly low. And I used to just ignore that and push through. And now what I do is I actually will say, okay, what's going to help me raise my energy a little bit? So whether that's just getting outside and taking a quick walk and getting some fresh air, perhaps I just, like will write down what is niggling in the back of my mind that's like bringing my energy down. Maybe I'll just reach out to a friend and just say, hey, I'm thinking about you. How are you doing? And just getting that like, oh my gosh, it's so nice to hear back from you, hear from you, like that. Those kinds of things can really be a quick energy boost, which I found more and more in my life is so important to, first of all, showing up for my clients and serving,
mm,
but also, just like you said, having general well-being and not just setting aside that as a priority because we're
yeah.
busy and we have things to attend to.
That's an interesting, brings up another question. So I'm not done yet, quite yet. But do you
Okay.
coach to some of those things about making space? I envision a lot of folks who are going through this just don't feel like they have the time or the space or the energy to kind of take it on. Do you
Yeah.
find yourself having to coach some of this stuff? So
Yes.
little self-care goes a long way when you're trying to tackle something like this?
Absolutely. So one of the things we do first of all is to find out where they're at with their energy level. A lot of people are in not great places when they're thinking about their career not being the one that they want long term, and so it can really, or they're in a really toxic or challenging work situation that they want to get out of. And so what we first work on is what brings your energy up and how can we engage you in practices to get there. And a lot of times I do hear, hey, I just, my work is all consuming and then I've got a family. And so I can't find time for those things. And then it really becomes a challenge of, what, if you can't find time to, engage in things that are going to help you build energy, that's going to be what sustains you through a career search, then, how are you really thinking about moving forward if there's no space in your life? I actually had one client who ended up quitting her job because the energy was so low for her. It wasn't that she didn't have space, but she had no motivation because she was struggling so much with her work environment. And it was interesting. This particular client, she spent a couple of months doing things that were really interesting and engaging for her. She was taking a cooking class and a tailoring class and perfumer, like exploring a perfumery, line of work. And she spent 3 months doing that. And she said, okay, now I'm ready to go back to what I was always doing, just for a different company, less toxic environment. And I now have a better sense of what I want to spend my time doing on the weekends and as sort of hobbies around it. So that like non-work, the where we prioritize non-work activities that really help sustain us for the careers that we want to have is such an important part of the process. And yes, coaching, that is a very big part of the coaching that I do.
That's cool. I've talked on the podcast about curiosity and creativity and people having some other things outside of work and passion that seem to be really, really helpful and come up in the conversation of purpose and meaning a lot, right? These other things that we have interests in can go a long way to energize us. So I'm glad we touched on that before I let you go. And I appreciate you sharing your own practices on meditation and journaling. I think that's useful for all of us to consider. One of the questions that I ask everybody, are there any podcasts, books that you'd recommend, podcasts that you listen to, other people's work that you think is interesting, if people wanted to kind of pick some of this up and explore it a little bit further, that you'd want to recommend?
Yeah, so I love Adam Grant's work. He has a podcast. Is it Work Life? I think is the podcast that he has, in a rethinking podcast. And there he brings up a lot of work topics that I think are absolutely, germane to the discussions that we have had. And then there's lots of podcasts that I like to consume that are more on the, kind of personal development and mindset side of the equation. So I really like Brene Brown's work. And then there's a podcast that is probably my favorite called We Can Do Hard Things with Glennon Doyle, Abby Wambach, and Amanda Doyle. And they spend a lot of time just talking about sort of how you live a purposeful, intentional life by engaging in the things that are hard, that really, cause us to grow and develop to our fullest potential. So those are some that come to the top of my mind.
Those are 3 great recommendations. And if people aren't aware, on the podcast website, there's now a resources tab where we catalog all of these things. So those will be 3 great additions to the resource catalog. So thank you for that. Kim, this has been great. I really appreciate your time. I think that the work that you do can be really impactful for people who are thinking about their career and purpose and where they should be in life, the work that they should do. So we appreciate you taking the time. Where do people find Kim Jones and the Kim Jones Alliance? Do you want to list websites or contact LinkedIn info? Where should people check you out?
So the 2 places that I am most is on my website, which is kimjonesalliance.com. And you can find me on LinkedIn. My handle is Kimberly S. Jones, and Kimberly is spelled Kimberlee.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. It's always great to see you. I appreciate you sharing your story and your work with us. And we'll hopefully see you again soon. Thanks for listening,
it was
everybody.
Such a pleasure. I so enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Likewise. We'll see you soon.